TitleMatchNetwork.com.
I'll tell you my first memory. I was born in 1948, and my father started wrestling in '49. His first match was in Minneapolis, Minnesota, against Abe King Kong Cashy. And he went about 18 minutes with him. He said, "Oh, this old guy, I'm gonna hammer him, and I'll get out of here quick." And he had his 3 football buddies: Bud Grant, who eventually coached the Minnesota Vikings, Billy Bye, who was a quarterback on the team, and Jim Molosky were there. And 3 pretty stout athletes. And my dad used to tell the story that he got in trouble and they jumped up and Cashy leaned over the rope and he said, "Sit down, punks," and they all sat back down. But then they told my father he was too small to wrestle in that area, so they sent us to Tulsa, Oklahoma, and we lived in a trailer, my mom and dad and I, and we traveled around that Oklahoma, Texas, Louisiana was the territory down there. His second week there, he won the light heavyweight championship, the NWA light heavyweight championship. But my fondest memory is that we used to stay in this trailer, and across from the trailer park, quite a ways away, was a big outdoor movie screen. And my dad would come home at night, and I'd sit on his shoulders, and we'd watch the movie. We couldn't hear anything, but we'd watch the movie.
Right.
So that was my first memory of, being on the road with my father. And then, of course, as we're driving down the road, he had these little songs and games we played all the time, and it was fun.
What was it like growing up with Verne as your father?
Well, it was, I tell the story. Growing up, my idols were Mickey Mantle and Bart Starr. And my dad came home one day and he said he was just in Washington, D.C., and that's when the old Washington Senators and the Yankees were playing them. And he was invited down to the bench, so he sat through the game. He said Casey Stengel went into the bench and slept the whole game, and he kind of hung with Mantle and Whitey Ford at the time. So he always knew they were my idol, and that when Washington moved to Minnesota, where were we?
You were talking about being on the bench with...
Oh, yeah. So the Washington Senators then moved to Minnesota, and the Yankees came to Minnesota to play. And my dad brought me down to the game and down to the locker room afterwards. And we walk in the locker room. Now, here's my idol, Mickey Mantle. Here comes Mantle, Ford, Moose Skowron, Tony Kubik, Bobby Richardson. They come running up, and they swarm my dad, And that's when I realized that, here's my idol, Even though the Yankees and Mantle still was, they gave me a nice autographed baseball, but they just swarmed him, and he was like a superstar to them. But you have to realize back in 1950, we first got the call, we were in Tulsa, Oklahoma, that wrestling was going on the network TV, on the old DuPont network, which is now WGN. And they invited Verne up to be on TV. They wanted a young guy that had a great amateur background, great wrestling background. He was an NCAA champion, a Big Ten champion, wrestled on the 1948 Olympic team. So, he really had the credentials. And so they brought him to Chicago, and Fred Kohler was the promoter at the time. This is 1950. And he said, Verne, at that time, Gorgeous George, and it was a lot of the gimmicks were in wrestling.
Right.
Much what you see today. But, so Fred Kohler said, Verne, here's what we're going to do. We're going to lower you from the ceiling. You're going to dress up as a Martian, and you're going to be lowered into the ring. And that's how we're going to open up the show. He said, Fred, here's the deal. Here's my background. Big Ten champion, NCAA champion, wrestled on the Olympic team. I've got a pair of tights and boots. You got 30 wrestlers here. I'm going down to the ring. Send them in one by one or 2 at a time or 3 at a time. If I can't beat them all, I'll quit right now. But otherwise, I'm going in the ring like this. And that's what he did. And he became the first real major star in professional wrestling. A lot of people don't know that, but World Guinness Book of Records, he was the first athlete besides Babe Ruth to make over $100,000.
He was the real deal, that's for sure.
Yeah,
so,
he really was. So, those are my fondest memories of him. And growing up with him as your father, it made it a little tough, at school.
That was my next question.
Yeah.
What was the best and worst thing about having a star pro wrestler as your father?
Because everybody wanted to try you.
Right.
No matter how old you were. second, third grade, kids wanted, they watched them in Minneapolis at that time. Wrestling came on Tuesday nights, right? That's when they wrestled at the arena, and they'd show the first couple matches and never show the last couple. So you get to school and everybody want to know, did he win or did he win? Who won? And in fact, I went to a Catholic school. And even though there was a few kids that wanted to try me out all the time. So I had to wrestle my father in the basement of our house, or our living room, and he made me learn the ropes early. He learned how, taught me how to defend myself.
Yeah.
Taught me balance and leverage, and how you can really kind of take care of anybody, even no matter what kind of fighters they are.
Did your father protect the business from you when you were growing up?
He protected it from everybody.
Okay.
Yeah, I mean, he did. He loved the sport and he believed it. And if you didn't believe it was real, then you shouldn't be in it.
Now, for those that don't know, how did Verne come to power, and how did the AWA become its own entity?
Well, Verne started in 1950 on the DuPont Network. It ran for 7 years. WGN had taken it over, and the wrestling was so popular, it ended up being on 7 days a week, and they burned it out. So then you had to pay to get on TV. So what Verne did, he started his own vitamin company. And the whole time Chicago's where they did the TV, but we always lived in Minneapolis, and he'd drive to Chicago every week for that. And in the meantime, they were expanding the territory in Minneapolis. He came back and bought in as a partner in '57, and they were only drawing about 400 people in Minneapolis. His job was to help expand it and get the talent in there and get this thing going. He knew what to do.
Okay.
The guys that ran it, Wally Carbo, Bill Casisto, they were great guys, but they didn't know how to run wrestling. My dad learned what television meant to professional wrestling. So when he got his vitamins going, he ended up getting on in Detroit, sponsored the show in Detroit. He didn't want to be in Detroit, and Bruiser ran it, mostly him and the Sheik. They became partners there. Verne concentrated on the Midwest and West, and that was his goal.
Is it true you had an idea for a wrestling project that was similar to what later became MMA?
Yes.
I guess, why did your version never really get off the ground?
No, my dad did, 1995.
Yeah.
We took it to the USA Wrestling, amateur wrestling. My father's a big sponsor of that,
right,
an amateur wrestling, and we took it out to them. His idea was to take the martial arts and go against the amateur wrestlers. And he said, real fight, And the Olympic Committee at the time and the USA Wrestling thought it would be too violent, and they wouldn't do it. The wrestlers themselves, Randy Couture was there, and Chuck Lindell.
Oh, yeah.
And those guys, they were all for it. The wrestlers wanted it because they wanted a shot at those, karate guys would tear them apart. But we couldn't come up with the rules that would allow it not to be so violent. And the Olympic Committee and USA Wrestling just wouldn't go for it. So they shot it down.
Now look at UFC.
Yeah, look at it. It's huge.
How do you want wrestling fans to remember your father, Verne Gagne?
I've thought about that a lot lately. And there's so many things. He meant so much, so many different people. Whether the people were 80 or the people were 10, he was one of the few guys that captured that everything in between. And just knowing him as a good guy. He always, the one thing he did, and hopefully I've learned it from him to some extent, he always took time for his fans. And he said that's the most important thing. He said he learned it from Jack Dempsey. And he would be the last one out of the arena. He would sign everybody's autograph. And he would not know you. And if you said hi to him, he'd have a conversation with you for 20 or 30 minutes. And when you got done, you'd think you were the greatest guy in the world. Right. And he did that to everyone. My brother-in-law traveled to Europe with him. And he said it was unbelievable. We'd be in frickin' Paris, and somebody had recognized him on the street, and he had talked 20 minutes to him. And before we were done, he would have a gathering of people there, and it was like they were all his friends. Huh. He said, we walked into a house down in Heyday, France. It said Gagne on it. He knocked on the door, introduced himself. It was a doctor. He had Verne come in. We ended up having dinner with him and found out they were related.
That's crazy.
Yeah.
Yeah.
And he said, whether we were in Germany, whether we were in France, whether we were in Italy, wherever we went, somebody knew him, and the conversation would start, and people would just gather around him. There isn't a day that's gone by since he's passed that I haven't thought about him.